You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
This episode is brought to you by the Nissan Armada Pro 4X. With a twin-turbo V6 engine ready to propel your adventures, up to 8,500 pounds of towing capacity to haul all your favorite toys and space for 8 passengers. Nissan's most powerful car yet will chew up and spit out anything you throw at it. Learn more about the all-new 2025 Nissan Armada at nissanusa.com. Towing capacity varies by configuration. See Nissan Towing Guide and Owner's Manual for additional information. Always secure cargo.
Hey everyone, welcome to the 490th episode of our Civil War podcast. I'm Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all, thanks for tuning into the podcast.
With this show, we'll finish up talking about the collapse of Grant's peripheral strategy in Virginia in the spring of 1864. As you guys will recall, this discussion has seen us cover the Battle of Cloyd's Mountain out in western Virginia, Sigel's defeat in the Shenandoah Valley at Newmarket, and most recently, Phil Sheridan's effort to take the Federal cavalry and whip Jeb Stuart out of his boots, which actually led to the Confederate Cavalier being mortally wounded at Yellow Tavern near Richmond on May 11, 1864, and dying the next day.
Even with the end of Sheridan's raid, Richmond was still in danger, as Union General Benjamin Butler's small army of the James, which was firmly ensconced at Bermuda 100, threatened the southern defenses of the rebel capital city.
An air of unreality clings to the Bermuda 100 campaign. After all, it seems unlikely that Richmond would be virtually undefended, but that was very much the case. It seems equally strange that a federal army of 36,000 men could get within 20 miles of the Confederate capital without a battle, yet Union naval control of the James River made it entirely possible. Finally, it seems implausible that in the face of such an opportunity, the Yankees would entrust its exploitation to a political general who was virtually devoid of combat experience, like Ben Butler, but that's just what they did. Taken together, these, shall we say, peculiarities comprise the Bermuda 100 campaign's core facts, and each actually had a rational explanation. The fact Richmond was protected by little more than a corporal's guard reflected a deliberate choice on the part of the Confederate authorities. You see, unlike Lincoln's War Department, which usually ensured the forts ringing Washington were manned by at least 50,000 troops, Jefferson Davis chose to keep the fewest possible Confederate soldiers in the Richmond fortifications.
Faced with limited manpower and many hard choices, Davis generally opted to maximize the number of troops actually out in the field. For example, as of April 20th, 1864, the Department of Richmond comprised only a little over 7,100 troops. So, should a crisis arise, the Confederate War Department counted on calling up militia to help defend the capital until reinforcements from elsewhere could arrive on the scene.
Then, the ease with which a federal army could ascend the James stemmed from the fact the river was navigable from its mouth at Hampton Roads on Chesapeake Bay all the way up to Richmond. Another major factor was the slender resources of the Confederate Navy. Ever since the loss of Norfolk in May 1862, the rebels had conceded control of the James estuary to federal gunboats. The Confederates didn't attempt to defend the James River until it narrowed dramatically just north of Bermuda 100 and twisted in a series of half a dozen hairpin bends.
There, the rebels had sown electrically detonated mines, or what back then they called torpedoes. Then, just upriver from the last of the hairpin bends, there was Fort Darling, a large earthen fort that commanded the James from the crest of 90-foot-tall Drewry's Bluff. Farther upriver lurked a squadron of Confederate rams and ironclads.
All of that's to say that a federal naval force could easily land Butler's 36,000 men at Bermuda 100, which was below or downriver from the Confederate defenses on the James. And with cooperation from Butler's soldiers, the Union naval force might well be able to make its way past the torpedoes, reduce Fort Darling, and support the Army in its bid to seize Richmond itself.
So we've seen why Richmond was so lightly defended, and how an army of 36,000 Federals could get within 20 miles of the Confederate capital. But what about a political general like Ben Butler being in command of such an important expedition?
Well, Butler may have so far in the war failed to distinguish himself in any major combat operations in the field, but Ulysses S. Grant had supplied him with 2 corps commanders who possessed that combat experience in abundance. Major General William Baldy Smith, who led 18th Corps, had fought in both the Eastern and Western theaters. And Major General Quincy Gilmore, who commanded 10th Corps, had waged a determined, though unsuccessful campaign to batter through the defenses that guarded Charleston, South Carolina.
Grant expected these 2 West Pointers, especially Baldy Smith, who Grant held in high regard, to supply the sound military judgment that Butler lacked. Grant trusted they would be responsible enough to give sound advice and expected Butler would be sensible enough to accept it.
Well, as it turned out, Grant was wrong on both counts. The problem began with the fact that even a seemingly golden opportunity, like landing a force at Bermuda 100 and threatening Richmond from the south, still had complications that needed to be overcome.
With Richmond 15 miles to the north, the critical railroad hub of Petersburg 8 miles to the south, and the tracks of the crucial Richmond and Petersburg Railroad less than 5 miles beyond the waist of the Bermuda 100 Peninsula, Butler was poised to strike at 3 critical targets. That was the opportunity.
Yet Butler's very proximity to these targets not only provided opportunity, but also danger, since the Confederates would no doubt react sharply to the threat Butler represented. In fact, the more aggressively Butler acted, the more dangerous to the Confederates he would become. And the more dangerous he became, the more strength they would assemble to oppose him. Knowing this, Butler believed he needed to conduct his campaign with prudence.
Butler began sensibly enough, and in accordance with Grant's explicit instructions, by safeguarding his base of operations. At the waist of the Bermuda 100 Peninsula, only about 5 miles separated the James and Appomattox rivers. After landing on May 5th, Butler spent the entirety of the 6th fortifying the narrow waist of the peninsula and continued to have the troops strengthen the earthworks for several days thereafter.
In the meantime, he probed toward the Richmond and Petersburg Railroad. A brigade of Federals advanced on May 6th, and 4 brigades did so the following day. Each of those forays resulted in clashes with rebel forces. The fighting sharpened Butler's sense of caution. Besides considering the Confederate reaction to his threat, he believed he also had to consider what he would do in the event that Grant's offensive, like so many before it, crumbled in the wilderness in the face of Robert E. Lee's slashing counterattacks.
The military geography also gave Butler pause, especially when coupled with his rather vague written instructions from Grant. Once he secured Bermuda 100, Grant's orders simply called for Butler to, quote, act from there, looking upon Richmond as your objective point.
Grant steered clear of telling Butler how the operation was to be conducted, but the one specific was that Butler must, quote, use every exertion to secure footing as far up the south side of the James River as you can, and as soon as possible, end quote. In other words, Butler was to advance from Bermuda 100 toward Richmond while hugging the south side of the James. However, Butler was very aware such a movement would leave his base at Bermuda 100 vulnerable to whatever Confederate reinforcements might come up from the Carolinas. That threat suggested to Butler that he might be better off first capturing Petersburg, or at least blocking the approaches from that direction. But a movement on Petersburg would have to be made in strength, and if Butler did so, he would in effect be marching directly away from Richmond, which was the target Grant had ordered him to threaten.
Butler solved the dilemma by concluding it would be better to wait until Grant got closer before he, Butler, moved to directly threaten Richmond. In the meantime, Butler would make a subsidiary stab at Petersburg, aimed less at capturing the place outright than at destroying the railroad linking it with the Confederate capital.
And so, on May 9th, Butler marched out with 9 brigades. Around mid-afternoon, the Federals reached Swift Creek, about 2 miles north of Petersburg, and there found a force of Confederates posted on the stream's opposite bank. The two sides sparred inconclusively because Butler made no attempt to force the issue. Instead, he put some troops to work tearing up the railroad tracks.
Later that afternoon, Butler met with his 2 lieutenants, Baldy Smith and Quincy Gilmore, to discuss plans for the next day. With no news yet from Grant, Butler thought it best to continue putting off any move toward Richmond and instead carry on threatening Petersburg. He proposed to have the troops storm across Swift Creek and advance as far as the Appomattox River, just short of the city.
Meanwhile, the Federal division at City Point would support the movement by launching a diversionary foray of its own. Butler asked Smith and Gilmore for suggestions. They had none, and so, as far as Butler was concerned, the matter was settled. His plan would be put into effect the following day.
Although neither said anything to Butler, in reality, neither Smith nor Gilmore liked his plan. To them, it seemed unimaginative and likely to result in casualties out of proportion to its limited purpose.
And so, as soon as Butler departed, Gilmore turned to Baldy Smith and suggested an alternative course of action. He said, why not withdraw to the Bermuda 100 defenses? Construct a pontoon bridge across the Appomattox River, and advance against Petersburg's rail connections with the South. Well, Smith saw the advantages to Gilmore's proposal. It avoided a needless battle at Swift Creek. It got the Federals across the Appomattox River, enabled the advance on Petersburg rail connections to be directly supported by the division at City Point, and offered the chance to destroy new railroads rather than simply continue wrecking the tracks of the Richmond and Petersburg. So, at around 7 p.m., Gilmore put his proposal in writing. Then he and Smith signed it and sent it to Butler.
In theory, the 2 experienced Corps commanders were providing Butler with sound professional advice, just as Ulysses S. Grant hoped they would. But they were going about it in a way that was far more likely to antagonize Butler than to make him feel bolstered by their support.
Butler was acutely aware that, as a political general in command of a military department, he was in a sticky situation. Because he knew that his superior, Grant, would have preferred him merely to manage the administrative duties of the job and leave the actual conduct of field operations to Baldy Smith. But to Ben Butler, that course was unacceptable. He possessed and would exercise the right to command all the troops in his department. And by taking such a stand, Butler forced Grant either to back down or take the politically expensive step of removing him from command. In the end, Butler got his way, but he still anticipated that Smith and Gilmore would attempt to challenge his authority.
And now, in Butler's eyes, the challenge had come, and in writing, which a seasoned lawyer like Ben Butler saw as an attempt by Smith and Gilmore to place their opposition to his plan officially on record.
And as a shrewd political operative, Butler guessed that since the two generals had submitted this alternative scheme right after his departure, that meant they had clearly doubted his plan, even as he'd explained it to them, and asked for their advice. But as Butler saw it, instead of voicing their concerns to his face, they instead chose to put them in writing, thereby ensuring their lack of confidence in him and his plan would be part of the official record.
As Ben Butler saw it, the knives were out, and so his response was immediate, decisive, and dripping with contempt. Quote, "While I regret an infirmity of purpose, which did not permit you to state to me, when I was personally present, the suggestion which you make in your written note, but left me to go to my headquarters under the impression that another and far different purpose was advised by you, I shall not yield to the written suggestions which imply a change of plan within 30 minutes after I left you. Military affairs cannot be carried on, in my judgment, with this sort of vacillation."
Well, the whole point of this blistering response was to humiliate Baldy Smith and Quincy Gilmore and underscore the fact that Butler was in charge. In point of fact, though, by the time he wrote his reply to them, Butler had decided to scrap his own plan. That's because that evening, a message had arrived from the War Department, erroneously indicating that the Army of the Potomac had fought a pitched battle with the Army of Northern Virginia, that the Confederates were, quote, in full retreat for Richmond, end quote, and that Grant was pursuing them. A second message, passing along more bad info, indicated that Grant was, quote, on the march with his whole army to form a junction with you.
In Butler's mind, in light of that news, he ought to cancel any further operations aimed at Petersburg or the railroads, since the time had come for him to move upon his main objective, Richmond, by advancing up the south bank of the James River, as Grant's original instructions had specified.
In light of these supposed new developments, the rest of Butler's biting letter to Smith and Gilmore informed them that the next day, the force threatening Petersburg would pull back to Bermuda 100, and the Army of the James would prepare itself to move on Richmond.
Hilton brings you new ways to stay, with experiences that let you capture the glory days. Introducing the Graduate Hotels. Each inspired by local college towns, these stays are always original and never boring. Get in touch with traditions all across the country and enjoy a stay that's a class above the rest. Book at Graduate Hotels with Hilton Honors Points at Hilton.com. It's a win-win. Hilton, for the stay.
That's your money saying it's time for a McDonald's run. Because with new McValue at McDonald's, you get more than you expect. Like buy a 6-piece McNuggets and add a McChicken for just $1. Your money says let's go. Get more than you expect with new McValue. Prices and participation may vary. Valid for item of equal or lesser value.
Ben Butler began his advance toward Richmond on May 12th. The same morning, federal troops stormed the Muleshoe, though of course Butler had no idea of the fierce fighting at Spotsylvania. Instead, he believed that Lee's army was in headlong retreat toward Richmond, with Grant's forces in hot pursuit.
Butler never intended to capture Richmond, and his orders didn't actually require him to try. Instead, he'd simply march toward the Confederate capital, make a demonstration threatening its southern defenses, and wait for Grant to arrive with the Army of the Potomac. And that course of action made sense, since by May 12th, the rebels had amassed so many troops to defend Richmond that any attempt by Butler to storm the city's defenses would have been bloodily repulsed. Well, that was true by May 12th, but what Butler didn't know was that until a few days previously, the southern approaches to Richmond had been almost wide open.
When Butler's troops landed at Bermuda 100 on May 5th, the sole Confederate force available to confront him was 750 troops under Major General George Pickett, who was at Petersburg, wrapping up his final hours as a district commander in the Department of North Carolina and Southern Virginia. Pickett had already received his orders to proceed by rail to Hanover Junction, where he would rendezvous with the brigades of his division, which were currently scattered about on detached service. Pickett and his men would then join Lee's army along the Rapidan.
However, reports of dozens of federal gunboats and transports steaming up the James River plainly signaled that Richmond and/or Petersburg was in danger. So Pickett promptly raised the alarm with his department commander, P.G.T. Beauregard, and the authorities in Richmond. But Butler had unintentionally landed at Bermuda 100, where Confederate military boundaries were overlapping and ill-defined, and so it took time for the War Department in Richmond to sort things out and formulate a response to the threat.
As a result, Pickett endured a harrowing 5-day ordeal in which he bore the responsibility for confronting Butler's Federals, but with a vastly outnumbered force and limited authority. By May 10th, Pickett was in a state of nervous exhaustion and asked to be placed on medical leave.
However, by then, the Confederate authorities had assembled additional troops to address the threat posed by Butler. 1,350 by May 7th, 2,670 by the 8th, and 7,500 by May 10th. Along with a field force detached from the Richmond garrison, 5,000 men under Robert Ransom, that total was more than sufficient to conduct a viable defense. And an overall command of the forces pulled together to confront Butler's Federals was P.G.T. Beauregard.
Beauregard arrived at Petersburg on the morning of May 10th, the same day that Butler pulled back to Bermuda 100 in preparation for his move toward Richmond. Taking stock of the situation, Beauregard realized that an opportunity existed not merely to block Butler's move, but to launch an attack that might destroy the Army of the James.
True, the Federal force outnumbered Beauregard's own, but by May 10th, it was definitely known the Yankees were commanded not by Ambrose Burnside, as first reported, but by Benjamin Butler, and Beauregard was confident he could best any enemy force commanded by Butler. Further, Beauregard viewed the peninsula of Bermuda 100 as a cul-de-sac where the Federals might be trapped should Butler be forced to retreat. All in all, given the identity of his foe and the nature of the geography, Beauregard viewed taking the offensive as a win-win proposition.
The authorities in Richmond, Jefferson Davis, along with his military advisor, Braxton Bragg, and the Secretary of War, James Seddon, agreed with Beauregard's assessment and gave him the green light to launch an attack on Butler. They hoped that the success of the attack would allow thousands of Confederate troops currently tied down defending Richmond to be freed up and sent to Robert E. Lee's hard-pressed army.
Even so, it would take a few days for Beauregard to prepare his counterstroke, and during that time, tensions in Richmond continued to build. The news from every side was bleak. Grant was on the attack at Spotsylvania. Averill and Crook had struck in southwest Virginia. Sigel was marching up the Shenandoah Valley. Butler, of course, was advancing up the south bank of the James. Nor was this all. For acting in support of Butler's expedition, a force of 3,000 Union cavalry under Brigadier General August Kautz had gone raiding into Southside Virginia and burned 2 bridges on the Weldon and Petersburg Railroad, an important supply artery and the most direct route by which Confederate troops in the Carolinas could be redeployed to defend Richmond. Until the damage done by the Yankee cavalry raiders could be repaired, rebel reinforcements from the Carolinas would have to walk the 10-mile gap between the destroyed bridges, creating substantial delays.
Finally, Phil Sheridan, with a large force of Union cavalry, had reached the outskirts of Richmond. The Confederate authorities worried about Sheridan piercing the capital's weakly held northern defenses, and so they urged Beauregard to immediately concentrate all available troops at Richmond.
However, Beauregard balked. He wished to concentrate his forces, including the reinforcements coming up from the Carolinas, at Petersburg. But Secretary of War Seddon insisted Beauregard send all available troops to Richmond at once, saying, quote, "This city is in hot danger."
In the meantime, Butler had started his demonstration threatening Richmond. On May 13th, he fought a preliminary engagement that won him control of the outer fortifications of the Confederate defensive position at Drewry's Bluff. After that, though, he couldn't go farther without forcing a battle, so he consolidated his lines and pondered his next move.
Beauregard did the same. Having lingered at Petersburg until the last of the reinforcements arrived from the Carolinas, he finally reached Fort Darling around 3 o'clock in the morning on May 14th. He immediately met with the chief engineer in charge of Richmond's defenses, Colonel W.H. Stevens. Stevens pulled out a map showing the overall situation. Grant and Lee were at Spotsylvania. Sheridan's raid was over, and he was riding down the peninsula toward the James River landings. The bulk of the Confederate force was at Drewry's Bluff, while a small detachment under Major General W.H.C. Whiting covered Petersburg.
Butler's Federals had assumed a defensive posture just south of Drewry's Bluff. Beauregard, who by now had some 20,000 troops at his disposal, was certain he could take the offensive and force Butler to retreat. However, at best, such a victory would merely neutralize the threat posed by the Army of the James, not destroy it. To crush the Yankees, Beauregard estimated he'd need at least 15,000 additional men who could only come from Robert E. Lee's army.
And Beauregard, bless his heart, didn't think getting those reinforcements was out of the question. But he knew it would require a daring expedient. Specifically, why not have Lee send the 15,000 men at once, then fall back swiftly to the Richmond fortifications, where he could easily hold off Grant's Federals?
As soon as the 15,000 reinforcements arrived, Beauregard would attack Butler, crush him, then turn and join up with Robert E. Lee and deliver a crushing blow to the Army of the Potomac.
Without taking the time to commit the details of his plan to writing, Beauregard sent Colonel Stevens galloping to Richmond with instructions to verbally present it to Jefferson Davis or Braxton Bragg.
When Stevens reached Richmond, the sun wasn't up yet. Jefferson Davis was ill, and the president's aides refused to waken him at such an ungodly hour. However, Stevens was able to meet with Braxton Bragg, who decided he should ride out and discuss the matter with Beauregard in person.
When Braxton Bragg reached Fort Darling later that morning, Beauregard filled him in on his plan, then ended by declaring, "Bragg, circumstances have thrown the fate of the Confederacy in your hands and mine. Let us play our parts boldly and fearlessly. Issue those orders, and I'll carry them out to the best of my ability. I'll guarantee success."
Bragg rode back to Richmond to discuss the plan with Jefferson Davis. When Bragg left Beauregard, Beauregard was under the impression Bragg favored it, but in fact, Braxton Bragg thought it was a terrible idea and raised over a half a dozen objections to it when he discussed it with Davis.
The most important of Bragg's objections was that Robert E. Lee couldn't be expected to retreat some 60 miles while closely pursued by Grant without putting the Army of Northern Virginia in grave danger, and that at any rate detaching troops from Lee was unnecessary, since, in Bragg's opinion, Beauregard's present force was sufficient to crush Butler, quote, if promptly and vigorously used.
Jefferson Davis actually went out in person to listen to Beauregard's proposal, but merely as a courtesy, since the Confederate president had already made up his mind to veto it. Davis told Beauregard he would have to use only the troops he already had on hand to attack Butler.
It took another day for Beauregard to organize the attack, but Butler remained obligingly inert. The final plan called for the Confederate left wing under Ransom to make the main assault and cut the Federals off from the James River, while the rebels' right wing, led by Major General Robert Hoke, would pin down the rest of Butler's force and lend support to Ransom's attack as needed. Meanwhile, the troops under Whiting, who were then covering Petersburg, would advance northward and strike the Federals' left rear.
The battle began before sunrise on May 16th. A dense fog shielded Ransom's rebels as they approached the Federal right, but the fog also threw his attack into disarray after it initially pierced the enemy lines. Although hundreds of prisoners fell into Confederate hands and a number of Union artillery pieces were captured, it proved impossible for Ransom to press home his advantage and turn the Yankees' right flank.
Hoke's supporting attack made some initial headway, but ran into trouble. So by mid-morning, it was apparent that Beauregard's offensive had stalled. Whiting's small force, which was a mere footnote in the original plan, now became the Confederates' principal hope for restoring momentum to the attack.
But that hope was dashed when Whiting failed to press forward aggressively and allowed a small blocking force of Federals to hold him up all day. There were reports he was drunk, but Whiting maintained that he was ill on May 16th and suffering from exhaustion.
Whatever the case, Whiting's troops played no role in the Battle of Drewry's Bluff, and Beauregard's offensive failed to overcome the Federal defenses. Nevertheless, surprisingly, the Yankees retreated, because when all was said and done, the general who defeated Ben Butler wasn't P.G.T. Beauregard, but Butler himself.
When the Confederates attacked out of the fog early on May 16th, it soon became obvious to Butler that the heaviest enemy blow was aimed at his right, the part of the line held by Baldy Smith's 18th Corps troops.
Butler calmly reasoned that if they were concentrating against Baldy Smith, the rebels must have reduced their strength opposite Gillmore's 10th Corps. He therefore urged Gillmore to attack, but Gillmore never did. In the meantime, Smith, discombobulated by the fog and fearing the worst, ordered his units to fall back. Presently, Gillmore did the same, and so by early afternoon, the Federals had taken up a new position about a mile behind their original lines.
The situation was now curious. The Confederates hadn't pressed forward, following up the Federal withdrawal, since the rebel formations had been severely disorganized by the fighting and maneuvering in the fog. Even so, Baldy Smith and Quincy Gillmore had no stomach for standing and continuing the battle, let alone going over to the attack, especially after a report came in that a force of rebels, Whiting of course, was advancing from Petersburg.
With Smith and Gillmore not wanting to continue the battle, it seemed pointless to Ben Butler to linger in front of Drewry's Bluff any longer, so around 3 o'clock that afternoon, he gave the order to fall back to the Bermuda 100 defensive lines. All told, the battle at Drewry's Bluff on May 16, 1864, cost the Federals about 3,000 casualties, of whom nearly half had been captured. Confederate losses also totaled about 3,000 men.
When viewed objectively, in many respects, Butler had accomplished what Ulysses S. Grant expected of him. He had landed at Bermuda 100 and established a secure base of operations there. He had drawn reinforcements away from Robert E. Lee, and he had made a strong demonstration in the direction of Richmond.
But Butler's decision to retreat from Drewry's Bluff back into his lines at Bermuda 100 canceled out any advantages he had gained. Beauregard promptly advanced and sealed off the Bermuda 100 Peninsula with an entrenched line of his own. Having thus corked the bottle in which Butler had placed himself, Beauregard was able to send 7,000 troops off to reinforce Robert E. Lee, with the promise that more would follow.
By May 18th, all 5 of the subsidiary offensives set in motion by Grant were over. 3, Averill, Sigel, and Butler, had met outright defeat, while even the 2 success stories, Crook and Sheridan, were no longer in position to threaten Confederate resources or pin down rebel troops.
For Grant, the bad news came in rapid succession. That day, as Hancock's troops recoiled from their attack at Hell's Half Acre at Spotsylvania's Bloody Angle, a dispatch arrived from Henry Halleck, telling Grant of the Federal defeats at Newmarket and Drewry's Bluff in a few bitter sentences. Quote, "Sigel is already in full retreat on Strasburg. If you expect anything from him, you will be mistaken. He will do nothing but run. Butler has fallen back today. Do not rely on him."
The importance of the news was obvious. Grant told his staff, quote, "Lee will undoubtedly reinforce his army, largely by bringing Beauregard's troops, now that Butler has been driven back, and will call in troops from the valley since Sigel's defeated forces have retreated."
Yet Grant accepted the bad news with the calm resolve for which he was famous. Horace Porter, an officer on his staff, wrote, "The general was not a man to waste any time over occurrences of the past. His first thoughts were always to redouble his efforts to take the initiative and overcome disaster by success."
Porter recalled that Grant's reaction to the news his peripheral strategy had collapsed was to sit down and write out an order for the army to leave Spotsylvania. Grant knew there was nothing further to be gained here if Lee was about to be reinforced.
Instead, for the second time, the Army of the Potomac would swing around Lee's right flank and seek battle on better ground. And, according to Grant's new orders, that movement would begin the very next day.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is Backdoor to Richmond, The Bermuda 100 Campaign by William Glenn Robertson.
Remember, you can find a list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org. Also at the website, you can find info on joining the Strawfoot Brigade and supporting the podcast in that way.
Just like Leon, Trevor, and Anthony have done recently. So a big thank you to them. Thanks also to Kevin S. for his donation.
Just a reminder that the music you hear at the beginning and at the end of every episode is from the song Midnight on the Water, and we use it with the kind permission of Spiritwood Music.
Thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Rich and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.